The blizzard hit Cold Spine Ridge without mercy. Mara Ellison had lived alone in her mountain cabin for 3 winters, and she knew the difference between a bad storm and a killing one. This was a killing one. The wind screamed through the pines like something alive and furious, and the temperature outside had dropped below -30 before her thermometer simply gave up registering. She had her firewood stacked. She had her supplies. She was fine. Then she heard the sound at the door. Not knocking, something deeper than that. A low, collective pressing. Weight against wood. She opened the door 2 inches and the wind nearly ripped it from her hand, but in that gap she saw them, shapes in the white chaos. Pairs of eyes catching the cabin light. Dozens of them. Cats. Not house cats. These were mountain ferals, big-boned, thick-furred creatures that the locals called ridge cats, though Mara had always suspected they were something older than that. Something that had never quite been domesticated, even back when the world was younger. They were lean despite the cold, with wide paws built for snow travel, and they moved together with an unsettling coordination, like a school of fish turning all at once. They were freezing. She could see it, the way their bodies hunched, the involuntary shivers moving through fur and waves. Mara Ellison made a decision in approximately 1 second. She opened the door. "Get in," she said, as if they could understand her. "All of you. Now." They poured past her ankles like water. She counted 23 before she stopped counting. They moved through her small cabin with the focused efficiency of soldiers occupying new territory. 2 immediately claimed the space beneath the wood stove. 6 arranged themselves along the south wall where the firelight was warmest. Several leapt onto her bed, she noted this with resignation, and formed a dense, breathing pile. A few simply sat in the middle of the floor, staring at her with amber eyes. None of them made noise. That was the strangest part. 23 cats in a single room, and the only sound was the storm outside and the quiet crackling of fire. Mara got to work. She had emergency rations, canned fish, mostly, because she liked fish and also because she was the kind of woman who kept emergency canned fish. She opened 6 cans and set them out in a rough line on the kitchen floor. She filled every bowl, pot, and container she owned with water and placed them in clusters around the room. She pulled out spare blankets and laid them flat across the floor in layers, creating soft territory. She did all of this without speaking much, moving through the room like the cats were furniture she was working around. She didn't try to pet them. She didn't coo at them. She just worked, because that was what the situation required. One of them watched her the entire time. She noticed him after about 20 minutes, a massive tom, easily twice the size of the others, silver-gray with a darker stripe running from brow to spine. He had not taken food. He had not claimed a warm spot. He sat in the exact center of the room, perfectly still, and tracked her every movement with eyes that were not quite the color of amber but something deeper. Something older. She met his gaze once, briefly, then looked away and kept moving. Alpha Calvera, she would learn his name much later, and then she would understand what that stillness meant. But on that first night, she just thought, that one is in charge. The storm lasted 18 hours. During that time, Mara slept in her reading chair by the fire, because her bed was occupied by 8 cats who had no intention of moving. She woke every 2 hours to add wood to the stove, shuffling through the warm, breathing landscape of her cabin floor, stepping carefully between sleeping bodies. Twice she checked on small ones that seemed too cold, too still. One was a kitten, barely 4 months old, she guessed, a tiny calico thing wedged between 2 larger cats who had, she realized, specifically positioned themselves to shield it. She gently extracted the kitten, held it against her chest for 20 minutes, felt its shivering slow and then stop, then placed it back in the warmth of the pile. When she looked up, the silver tom was watching. She went back to her chair. Around 3 in the morning, when the storm was at its worst and the windows were solid white and the cabin made sounds she'd never heard it make before, something heavy settled across her feet. She looked down. The silver tom had relocated. He was curled across her ankles like a living blanket, enormous and warm, his eyes closed for the first time since she'd opened the door. Mara sat very still for a long moment. Then she reached down, slowly, and placed one hand on his back. He was warm beneath her palm, all that wildness, all that ancient ridge cat strangeness, radiating heat against her fingers. He didn't move. He didn't open his eyes. She kept her hand there until she fell asleep again. By morning the storm had broken. The light that came through the windows was the specific blue-white of post-blizzard mountain air, clean and brutal and beautiful. Mara rose stiffly, the silver tom displacing himself from her feet with liquid grace, and went to open the front door. The cold hit her like a wall. The snow was 4 feet deep on the porch and sculpted into strange shapes by the wind. The world outside was white and silent and absolutely still. The cats began to stir. One by one, they rose, stretched, shook themselves into wakefulness. They moved toward the open door and the snow beyond, gathering at the threshold. Mara stepped aside to let them pass. They filed out into the winter morning, not in the panicked scramble of released animals, but in the same coordinated way they'd entered, orderly, purposeful, ridge cats returning to their mountain. She watched them go. 19, 20, 21. 22. The silver tom had not moved. He sat beside her in the doorway, watching his pack disappear into the treeline, and made no move to follow. Mara looked down at him. He looked up at her. "You can go," she said. "I'm not keeping you." He blinked once, that slow, deliberate blink that cats use when they mean to communicate something they consider obvious, and then turned and walked back into the cabin. He jumped onto the arm of her reading chair, circled once, and settled. Mara stood in the cold doorway for another moment, watching the last of the ridge cats vanish between the snow-heavy pines. Then she closed the door and went to make coffee. The biologists who eventually came to study the ridge cat colony, 2 graduate students from the university in Vera Falls, armed with cameras and grant money and a great deal of theoretical knowledge, were deeply confused by what they found. The colony's alpha male, which they had been tracking for 3 years via radio signal, had apparently defected. He was living in a human dwelling on the edge of the ridge, sleeping on a reading chair, and allowing a woman named Mara Ellison to scratch behind his ears. "This is extraordinarily unusual behavior," one of them told Mara. "Is it?" said Mara, who was refilling Kale's water bowl. "Alpha males of this subspecies essentially never voluntarily enter human habitation. They're apex territorial animals. They don't choose people." Mara considered this. Outside, through the cabin window, the ridge was clean and white and endless. Somewhere out there, the rest of the colony moved through their territory, doing whatever it was that ancient cats did in winter mountains. Inside, Kale, which she had taken to calling him, for reasons she couldn't explain, the name had simply arrived in her mind and stayed, was methodically grooming his left paw with the expression of someone who found the entire conversation beneath him. "He was cold," Mara said simply. "I opened the door." The biologists looked at each other. "That's it?" "That's it." Later, after the biologists had left with their confused data and their footage of a ridge cat alpha napping on a chair cushion, Mara sat in her reading chair by the fire. Kale relocated from the chair arm to her lap, all 14 pounds of ancient, wild, utterly sovereign creature, and settled there with the finality of something decided. The thing that the biologists didn't understand, because it wasn't in any of their field guides, was this: Kale hadn't surrendered anything. He was still the alpha. He still ran his ridge. He had simply, with the cold pragmatism of a creature that had survived 10,000 winters, taken stock of an asset. She had opened the door. She had fed and warmed and cared for his entire pack without being asked, without hesitation, without requiring anything in return. In the language of the ridge, in the mathematics that predates human civilization by a considerable margin, that meant something. That meant she was under his protection now. The fact that Mara also scratched behind his ears very well was simply a bonus. She put another log on the fire. Outside, the mountain held its breath. Inside, something ancient and wild purred.